Well, welcome everyone. This is the Consumer Protection Wins and Fails webinar. It's a tech webinar hosted by the American Consumer Institute. ACI is a 501c3 educational research institute, and I'm Steve Posios. So today the webinar is going to deal with three very important issues. First is privacy and why we can't get Congress to pass comprehensive consumer protections. We're going to be talking about things such as, what needs to be done to advance privacy legislation in Congress. And secondly, we'll have a discussion on 5G. And it's really just the talk of tech circles right now. And what we really want to be discussing is how we get sound policies to promote this implementation of next generation wireless technology. How do we get the spectrum we need for 5G, and how will consumers benefit from this technology? And lastly, we're going to also discuss robocalls. Those unwanted nuisance calls that we get. What must be done to finally block these robocalls that have plagued consumers for many years? Excuse me. I'll have to get this. It's from Belarus. But before I do that, let me turn it over to Dr. Christina Pusak. She's the ACI Director in Policy and Research, and Chris will moderate a panel of policy experts today. Chris, please take it away.
Yes, thank you, Steve. Hi, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. So my name is Christina Pusak. I'm the Director for Policy and Research at the American Consumer Institute. And today we have some fantastic panelists with us who will share their opinions on these important issues. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce everyone without any further ado. We have Rosalind Layden, who's a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on evidence-based policy for information, communications, and digital technology industries. Dr. Layden is also a visiting researcher at Aalborg University Center for Communication, Media, and Information Technologies, and a vice president at Strand Consult, both in Denmark. Zenji Nakazawa is the FCC legal advisor on public safety and consumer protection to the chairman at the FCC. So Mr. Nakazawa advises Chairman Pai on public safety, homeland security, consumer protection, and enforcement issues. He joined the office from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, where he served as chief of the Policy and Rules Division. Prior to that, he served as deputy chief of the division and as a staff attorney and acting legal advisor in the Wireless Telecommunication Bureau. Last but not least, we have Tom Strubel, who is the Technology Policy Manager and Counsel with R Street Institute, where he leads R Street's work on telecom, antitrust, privacy, and data security issues. Previously, Tom was at Tech Freedom, where he worked as policy counsel, focused mostly on telecom and consumer protection issues, with an eye towards antitrust and market-oriented policy solutions. He previously also worked as a law clerk for the Competitive Carriers Association and for the Mobility Division of the Federal Communications Commission's Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. So again, we have a fantastic panel with us today that I'm very excited to hear from. And I'm going to go ahead and give each one of them a few minutes to tell us about these specific issues. Where are we at the moment? What does the landscape look like, and where are we headed? So, Rosalind, I would like to start with you, because Congress was all about privacy in the beginning of the year. So what changed?
Well, thank you so much, Christina, for having me. And I just want to say how much I appreciate the opportunity to be on your first webinar. I hope it's the first of many webinars. The American Consumer Institute does a very important role to educate policymakers and the public. And I really appreciate the sound foundation that you bring in economics. And it's great to be here today with two esteemed colleagues to talk about some of these key issues. So we want to talk about what's going on with privacy in the United States. Well, our listeners may be aware that many nations around the world are in the midst of making a variety of rules about the digital ecosystem. I would hasten to call them privacy because in many cases there's different names. For example, the one that many people talk about, the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, the word privacy does not appear in the text at all. So in many cases, we're talking about a lot of different things, and I think the lawyers on this webinar can appreciate you use different words, has different meanings. You're going to talk about different statutes. That means a lot. And part of the reason we're talking here today is consumers may think it's about one thing, but the policymakers may have something else in mind altogether. But in any case, there is, you could certainly say, there are many consumers, maybe not all consumers, but there are a number of people very concerned. We've had a number of data breaches. They continue to increase. People are concerned about going online, what information is collected. And we could certainly say that this also reflects the fact that we don't have a comprehensive privacy education. We have education in financial literacy, for health education, a lot of other areas, and we don't really have education about going online, being digitally literate, digitally competent. And my critique of all the discussion is we really lack a way to educate consumers, and certainly appreciate the work that ACI is doing to help consumers recognize what roles that they need to take to get themselves educated. But certainly, if you look at the Federal Trade Commission, which to date has done a lot of work to, they have a number of areas where they do provide oversight to the marketplace. There's a tremendous wealth of resources for people to learn about protecting your privacy, especially as it relates to children, but in a number of other areas. And I think those are great resources that we've developed that can certainly be shared, and we should take advantage of those things. But when we look at the US Congress, we have an impasse on a couple of fronts. It is mainly an issue about preemption, where we have the state of California, which has already how would you say, the Governor Jerry Brown, before he left office, he signed into law the California Consumer Protection Act. It was a piece of legislation that was hastily put together in about a week, and is a kind of a grab bag of different pieces of bits and pieces of rules, in some ways inspired by the European rules. I would say, if you look at what Europe has had in place for more than a year, it's 173 provisions, 17 different rights, 45 different regulations on business. It's really a mammoth kind of piece of legislation. But it's interesting, we can look at what have been the results of that to date. And I think that there's certainly a bit of quite a bit of buyer's remorse with regard to the European legislation, because the large technology companies have larger market share today than they did a year ago. And that has taken a number of people by surprise, because it thought, well, if we impose a massive kind of regulation, that somehow that would reduce the scale or the size of large companies. But I think as many can recognize, that regulation, very heavy-handed regulation, can tend to reward large companies because they're the ones with the large budgets and lawyers and compliance professionals who can comply. So the costs of complying with the many regulations of the European Union have fallen the hardest on small firms. So for example, I live in Copenhagen today. There's over 1,000 news sites I can no longer access in the US. For example, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune. It's so expensive to comply with European regulations that many newspapers just no longer serve their content in the European Union. And the compliance level to the European regulation is very low. It's estimated about less than half of all companies are complying with the regulation today. So the compliance rate is quite low. But what the European rules have done is it's certainly empowered the government. It's empowered a lot of people in lawsuits and plaintiffs to use more tools to be able to make complaints. Now, that may or may not be a good thing from the perspective of consumers, but one of the key critiques is that in many cases, the payouts from lawsuits, they tend not to go to end consumers. They will tend to go to law firms, litigation financiers, to regulators, and end consumers. But what I would think that we should pay attention to with the European rules, what we can learn from the United States, I think one of the key things is that the European rules have attempted to provide one standard, if you will, for all the European Union. And it's very interesting because the debate we have in the United States is that individual states are now taking on they're saying, well, we're going to make rules in Maine, and we're going to make a different set of rules in California, and a different set of rules in Wyoming, and so forth and so on. So 50 different sets of rules, a giant layer cake, which actually goes against the very idea of the US Constitution, which is from the beginning was the single market and the idea of a federal policy, so that that really helped the US with the internet. You could set up your web shop and you could sell across the 50 states. So that is now under threat if we look at 50 different sets of privacy rules. And the debate is the federal standard versus 50 different sets of standards. And that for any kind of online enterprise, whether a nonprofit organization, a business, an individual setting up a website, that's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to maintain all of those things. And it's also, from a consumer perspective, it's really difficult to say, what state is this website located? Where am I located? Which regulations apply? It's quite difficult indeed. So what really matters for consumers is, and where I think Congress has an opportunity, certainly to step in to assert, a federal preemption, the role of the federal government, especially with relate to the internet, which is a federal policy, to create the common set of standards. We can learn in certainly the areas where we've had a lot of success. We've had very strong sector-specific rules for sensitive information, whether that was financial, whether it's related to children, whether it relates to health information. And we have allowed the those different sectors to work with the regulators to evolve the right kinds of rules that were specific to the nature and the degree of the sensitivity of the information. So my hope is that Congress can learn what's happened in the European Union. 10 years after the series of privacy regulations have been put in place, people do not report feeling greater trust online. I think that that's a really key indicator when it comes to consumers. Do people feel a greater sense of trust? And they certainly don't. And that has a lot to do with, there is no element of consumer education. There is no element of some kind of a dialogue that would help consumers feel that they have a better sense about what they're doing online. So that's missing. So there's an opportunity we have in the US to actually evolve a scientific kinds of rules that are based in evidence, that are based in scientific reviews, and working with for example, the National Institutes of Standard and Technology, where they have looked at various technological and privacy enhancing technologies that we can deploy online. So bringing those things together, working with the Federal Trade Commission, and this is really where I think the U.S. can be able to preserve our internet economy, which has been so vital for the U.S. and its economic development, but also playing a greater role to help consumers have a better sense about being informed when they go online about what they're doing. So I'm looking forward to our other discussions. I just want to say there's a link here when we look at the other areas, when we talk about consumers. Certainly, I'm excited to hear what Zenchi has to say, because it's really the golden age of public safety at the FCC. Never have we had so many things coming out from the FCC about public safety. It's so vital. And certainly when we talk about 5G, that the role of spectrum is so vital in terms of having a competitive market, efficient prices, market entry, and new networks. So all of these things are really the key issues in the telecom sector today when it comes to consumers.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Roslyn. Thank you for the very comprehensive overview on where we are with the privacy issue today. So what I'd like to do next, I'm going to switch to Tom because I'd like to know, when it comes to 5G tech, what should consumer expect from this technology? How can they benefit? Where are we today with this technology? And what are some of the future developments? So, Tom?
Sure. Thank you, Christina. Happy to field that question. And thank you to ACI for inviting me to join this webinar today, especially because talking about such a timely topic, one of the favorites of mine, spectrum policy, and telecom more broadly. It's in a very exciting time in the spectrum world right now for, I guess, lots of different reasons. Most notably, average consumers probably aware that two of the big four US carriers, T-Mobile and Sprint, have been attempting to merge for about the past year. And it looks like we may be getting close to the final resolution of that, which would be potentially very exciting for the tens of millions of customers on those networks. But more broadly, spectrum policy right now, it's an exciting time, mergers aside, because we're on the cusp of the next revolution of wireless technologies, from 4G, which was like LTE, what we had for the last decade, to 5G, the next standard developed by 3GPP. It all gets very technical, but those new standards have been finalized now, and they're being rolled out by carriers. They're actually in a few cities, including Washington, D.C., where I live and work, although there are very few phones out there that can use this spectrum right now. So it's not quite there in terms of in your pocket real service, but it is right around the corner. So it is fair game to start getting excited because 5G will not just bring better connectivity. Of course, it'll be faster download speeds, and better coverage, but importantly, things like latency and reliability, those are key, I guess, factors that in your signal connection, you might not realize how important they are, but for some of the new technologies that are coming out, like driverless vehicles, a lot of Internet of Things, smart sensors that government or commercial users can deploy, automated manufacturing, I mean, the list goes on, but gaming, virtual reality, augmented reality, all these things that rely on near real-time instantaneous communication, those would be very tough to do over a 4G connection because on the best case scenario, you're probably gonna have 10 or 25 milliseconds of latency. But with 5G, we're talking about sub 10, maybe even 1 millisecond latency, which actually feels instantaneous because that's so fast that your body cannot even process that amount of latency. So we're talking about a whole new generation of applications and services and devices that can use this new body of standards. I mean, some of them we know about and they're being tested and deployed already today, but a lot of things we don't even know what potentially could be built upon this new platform with all the brilliant engineers out there. So for me, that's really what I'm excited about, is the great unknown, all the sort of future innovations that we'll see in the coming 5 to 10 years that are, I guess, 5G holds the promise to. So super excited about that. And if we want to get deeper into policy, less more of the consumer side of things, a lot of what the FCC has been doing in the last 2 years personally excite me pretty greatly in terms of spectrum, getting more spectrum available for commercial users, both on the licensed and unlicensed side of things. More work on infrastructure deployment in terms of cutting red tape and expediting and streamlining those processes, also super important. Also revitalizing the workforce, because at the end of the day, these networks have to be deployed and operated by real people, and we need good construction workers and bureaucrats, lawyers, all sorts of people to go out actually into the wild and deploy cable, build towers, install antennas. So 5G is not just going to be good for the telecom industry, of course it will, but in terms of the broader American populace, the labor workforce, and of course all the entrepreneurs who will build new things and businesses that can work on these new networks, I think there's really good reason to be excited across the board, but happy to get into more specific details later.
Thank you, Tom. So I'm going to switch to the issue of robocalls. And that's because recent reports show that Americans were hit with 26.3 billion robocalls in 2018. That's a 46% increase from the previous year. So Zenji, do you want to tell us more about what is the exact problem with these robocalls and what should consumers specifically know about this issue?
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to make sure if you can hear me okay.
We do hear you perfectly.
Okay, Okay, fantastic. I did want to convey, first of all, Chairman Pai's gratitude to ACI and Christina and Steve. Thank you so much for holding this webinar for us. ACI, I think, historically has been, at least with this administration, been a really strong partner with the FCC. So I want to do three things when I talk about robocalls, because this is like the proverbial gift that keeps on giving, but it's a gift that you don't want to get. What's been happening, just to put it in framework, number one, looking at the landscape, you had quoted, yes, about 240,000 complaints of unwanted calls in 2018 at the FCC. The other interesting fact to point out is that a lot of illegal robocalls go unreported, so that means that number may be slightly deflated. The other thing is that we have some third-party commercial enterprises that say, hey, and by one account, in November 2018 alone, there were 5.1 billion robocalls were placed in that month. So that extrapolates out to about 170 million calls per day. And they even went so far as to say, hey, that's 7.1 million calls per hour and 2,000 calls per second, and an average of 15.7 calls per person. So not to belabor the point, but you get the idea that robocalls are really getting out of hand. Not only is the number of robocalls increasing, but also the methodology has changed. So as we have played cat and mouse with the robocallers out there, they have changed their game somewhat to say, hey, well, let's use caller ID. So now we have this approach called neighbor spoofing or caller ID spoofing, where it looks like it's a number, a 202 number, for example, in Washington, that's coming maybe from your neighborhood or from your office. It could be a friend, and you are inclined to pick up that phone call. And then once you pick up the phone call, boom, they've got you already. They've already hooked the fish. So looking at caller ID spoofing, it's about 35,000 complaints we've received in the past 6 months already on this. So that's just phenomenal, because it was something ID spoofing was not a concept 2.5 years ago. But now with that landscape, let's take a look at the question, well, what can we do? Because this is really a monumental problem that affects all of us. And it all reminds me of, well, how do you eat an elephant story? And the answer is, well, you take it one bite at a time. And so that's what we're doing at the FCC. What we're doing is looking at this problem holistically. And we've taken three tracks, if you will, to approach this problem. One is we're taking really aggressive enforcement. And number two, we're making surgical policy cuts at looking at this problem, as well as regulatory enhancements. And third, we're teaming up with our partners at the FTC, the State Attorney General's office, and also our private stakeholders in industry. So with those three, let's just walk that back a little bit and unpack it. First, let's take a look at enforcement. So between 2010 to 2018, the Commission took enforcement actions involving roughly 245,000 or $246 million against violators for apparent violations of the Truth in Caller ID Act or the Telecommunications Consumer Protection Act. Now, these, just to be clear, these aren't just like little onesies and twosies. These are really big fish. In one instance, we're talking about a bad actor who was literally spoofing 96 million illegal robocalls over just a 3-month period. And God knows what he was doing before that time. So, and he's been in that company was in business for at least 10 years. Another case, we closed down a well-known operation that I know personally my parents have been hit with, and that was like hospitality, a call that comes in that purports to be like a travel or hospitality company, and they say, hey, you want a free trip, or would you like a free trip? TripAdvisor and Expedia or Hilton or Marriott whatever, we have a special deal and we'd like to offer that to you. So we actually closed that operation down. We slapped them with a huge fine, and that company is out. But it doesn't end there. We have lots of enforcement actions in the hopper, and we are aggressively pursuing that. So we're taking a really sharp edge to getting these bad actors. Number two, let's take a look at what the FCC has done as far as regulations go. Last year, 2 years ago, we authored carriers, hey, look, don't be afraid. You can block calls from certain spoof numbers. And we specifically identified what types of spoof numbers. These are numbers that no reasonable person should use them. They are, in fact, illegitimate numbers because they're either invalid, or they haven't even been allocated yet, or they're unused, or because they've already been allocated to an actual subscriber to receive incoming calls. The second thing we've done is, and really important, is we've authorized the creation of a reassigned numbers database. This is important because we've all gone to the store, and if we don't port our number, let's say we get a new number. I know I was setting up my dad with a new iPhone, and you get a new number. So unfortunately, that number just isn't pulled out of the air. That was presumably someone else's number. And so what happens is that the providers that give you that number don't realize or have not checked whether that number has been used and fully disconnected, and also other folks informed down the stream that, hey, don't call this number because it's disconnected, it's being reassigned. Now, for the first time ever, Chairman Pai has stepped up and said, hey, common sense approach, let's look at getting industry participation and the experts in the field to create a first ever reassigned numbers database. And so we're looking at that, and hopefully we will have that in line, or at least functioning within the coming year. The other thing that we've done is we've really taken an aggressive stance to look at providers and how they can help us with blocking these calls. And so we've said to them in a separate item, hey, look, if you can use reasonable call analytics, which basically is an algorithm that takes that evaluates each call as it comes in to a caller, to a recipient of that call, you can block it if your call analytics say that that's a really bad number. But of course, we also have a provision so that errant calls don't get blocked. The consumer can say, hey, I want to opt out of that. No, thank you. But up to this point, that has not been a default, and that was a problem just because of consumer inertia. Like myself, for example, making the effort to call up and say, hey, I want to have call blocking is different than having the company automatically do that for you as a service at no additional charge. Now, we can talk later on, but there are also some liability issues from the carrier's point of view, but I just wanted to focus on the consumer interest aspect of that. The other thing is that Chairman Pai, from inception, coming in on his first day, he said, look, I want all of the major carriers out there to adopt some kind of a caller ID framework to properly authenticate calls under a standard. And that standard is currently being developed in industry called Shake and Stir. Shake and Stir is really important because it behind the scenes applies an algorithm to each outgoing call and to verify that that is in fact a true and valid call and not something coming from abroad or from an illegal robocaller. So we have that. He's had that out there, but he's actually gone a step further. So just this past June, we've issued a notice of proposed rulemaking that basically says, in black and white, through our rulemaking process, look, carriers, you need to step up to the plate and start implementing Shake and Stir. And if you can't do it by the end of the year, which he has been preaching from the get-go, then we're going to have to resort to some sort of affirmative prescriptive rules. He does not want to do that. On a little side note, there is that recently you might have heard that T-Mobile, AT&T, and Comcast have agreed to adopt shake and stir standard for their calls between their companies, which is really an important step forward and something that the chairman supports and has lauded publicly. So the other thing is that I think it was last week, we also issued another important rulemaking to implement Reassigned Act, and that was basically today there is a little bit of a loophole in our rules because we can't, prior to last week, we could not actually go outside of the U.S. to get extraterritorial jurisdiction over companies that started robocalls, let's say in a foreign country, and were affecting U.S. consumers. But now, for the first time, we have implemented rules pursuant to the Reassigned Act that gives us that ability to actually go after scammers that send us text or phone calls from foreign countries. This is a huge, huge development, and there's more to come out of that. Again, this just happened last week, and I can feel free to talk about that later on. So there are, lastly, I wanted to say, so enforcement was number one. Number two is looking at our policies. And number three, I just wanted to say that Congress has been a fantastic partner for the FCC in combating robocalls. We currently have two major bills that are on the floor. One is the Trace Act, which was adopted and pushed by Senator Thune and Markey, which basically helps strengthen our ability to attack robocalls by increasing fines, also extending our statute of limitations. And another one is the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act, and this was fashioned by Representatives Latta, Doyle, Walden, and Pallone, and this takes essentially what the chairman has always called for, a stir-shaking framework for caller ID authentication with no line item surcharges in people's bills, and seeks to make that a law. I think that's really important, and it's something that the Federal Communications supports wholeheartedly. With that, I just wanted to say thank you again, and this is, we're not trying to be a solo rider out in the distance, trying to John Wayne this robocall problem. We do recognize, and we hope industry at this point recognizes, that this is a holistic effort. We're working with our federal stakeholders at the state level as well, and with corporate and public interest groups as well. So happy to take questions.
Thank you, Zenji. Thank you for sharing with us info about FCC's work on how it's trying to protect consumers from robocalls. So I'm gonna switch back to privacy for a second, because Roslyn gave us a very comprehensive overview of like where we are and what's at stake for consumers. So I would like to get your opinion on what is actually at risk for consumers if work for bipartisan federal legislation is stalled. So, and what can we expect to be done in the future to get something across the finish line? And I'm asking this because you mentioned the California legislation, which will be come into effect just in a few months. So yeah, please, if you can let consumers know what they should know about this.
Right.
Roslyn.
Yes, so Christina, thank you for that question. I want to just take one bridge from what Zenji has shared about why it's, if we look at robocalls, why that's so important. And I want to applaud the FCC on this effort, and particularly Chairman Pai. When he became the chairman of the FCC, the very first thing on his agenda was robocalls. And if we study the consumer complaints at the FCC, at the FTC, robocalls are far and away the #1 complaint by the billions. And the fact that so much work has been done on this and continues to be done, it's really a testament to this FCC. I wish we could have the whole call to go into all the things that the FCC do. It's really the FCC of consumer protection, and I know ACI has been so much involved on the Consumer Advisory Committee. So that means a lot. And one of the things that's so important, what we learned about caller ID and robocalls, particularly in the area of privacy, is this. In the early days of caller ID, many of what would be self-proclaimed privacy advocates, they did not like caller ID because they said they were violating the privacy rights of the robocallers or the people who are making the telemarketing calls or whatnot. And the funny thing is today, nobody believes that. We actually think that we as the recipient of the call have a privacy right not to be bothered at the dinner hour or whatnot. But this really illustrates a key point in technology policy, is that regulation itself doesn't solve a problem. We can make all the regulations we want day in and day out. It may not stop people in foreign countries. We have to use technological means to solve certain problems. And that is also when we look at the issue of internet privacy, just thinking that if we add layers of rules that we will actually make things more safe, as opposed to fundamentally making better and different technologies, helping consumers to be more informed about what choices they make online, those kinds of things, that regulation has limitations. It doesn't do everything. But I think I want to answer your question very specifically. What is at stake? There is a lot at stake if we make the wrong rules, and particularly the number one premise of any regulation should be to do no harm. And the key concerns I have about the California rules is identity theft, because what we've already seen already with the European rules is that because of these so-called rights to access your own data, they too can be spoofed. You can pretend, I can say I'm Tom Struble and I want to access all my data. So we're already the kinds of these giveaway sort of things that says consumers should be able to grab all these things. In practice, they tend not to do it, but it's a seeming thing like we're doing something for consumers. We're actually giving a gift to hackers and spammers to pretend and take other people's identity, go and access other people's accounts, get their social security information, financial information, and so on. So we have a major identity theft potential if we would bring on board the California rules. That's a key issue. We have also seen what's happened with the what's called the Whois Database. This is the address book of the internet. Because of the rules in European has adopted, is now that the we can't find out who's putting up malicious websites online. If it's some kind of a child pornography or malicious actors, law enforcement is not able to get the information that they could in the past that was publicly available. So we have major harms that have been created as a result of these rules. Where I think that we have the opportunity, however, is we need to build upon the work of the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, which are the engineers who are working in these fields, the same way that the FCC has done with robocalls. They've brought together the industry, the engineers, the academics and scientists who actually have real technological solutions that we can implement that can improve the systems, make them more secure and make them more safe. And so I think the key takeaway for consumers is not to be fooled by the idea of, you know, granting seemingly rights to access your data necessarily makes you more safe. What you really want to have is that companies and organizations will continue to invest in their systems to make them more secure so that the data is not compromised in the first place. So my hope is that I hope that the recognition that both sides of the aisle see this. There's certainly an interest from Republicans and Democrats to make some kind of legislation. The challenge is, are we going to reward the sort of trial bar, those who want to make money on having regulations where they can go after a company and say, hey, you didn't fulfill requirement number 57 out of the 157 requirements, and therefore we're going to take you to court and sue you and make a lot of money. That's the concern. That these rules, which were supposed to be intended to protect consumers, turn out to be a tool to be abused by sophisticated litigation financiers and trial lawyers who know how to use the legal system to win particular winnings. So there is really a big issue at stake, and also keeping systems secure from a cyber perspective. That is now the key issue in the internet age.
Thank you, Rosalind. So it sounds like there's a lot at stake for consumers, especially when it comes to privacy, and that we have a national opportunity right now to get this right, to protect consumers. But we also have a national opportunity when it comes for 5G tech. And Tom already gave a few like his opinion about like what consumers should expect and how they would benefit from 5G. So are there any specific workable policy solutions that can encourage further investments and 5G deployment? What should we expect in the near future?
Sure. So yeah, as you said, there are sort of geopolitical implications for the race to 5G, to be the first country to sort of operationalize and roll out 5G. We suspect that country will also get a big leg up in terms of the innovations and new technologies and businesses built on top of that new standard. We think that's the case because we look back 10 years at 4G and LTE and think about all these new businesses that have sprung up since then, businesses like Uber, Airbnb, I mean, a couple of the most popular ones, but there are a lot that didn't exist 10 plus years ago and are now multi-billion-dollar companies because they were the first to take advantage of the better throughput, instantaneous sort of connectivity that 4G LTE brought as opposed to 3G. So we think that going forward, the US stands to gain tremendously if we are the first, or at least one of the first countries to broadly deploy 5G service throughout the country. So in that sense, we are sort of competing head to head with the likes of China, Japan, Korea, some of the leaders in Asia. Also, many European countries are also far along the way in terms of deploying 5G. And there's sort of two, I guess, broad dynamics of this race to focus on. One would be spectrum policy, the other deployment infrastructure, sort of red tape and bureaucracy. In terms of spectrum policy, the US is doing very well. If you break down spectrum into low, mid, and high band spectrum, don't worry too much about the lines between the two, but generally low band spectrum travels very far, doesn't have as much throughput or data. Ultra high band spectrum has lots of throughput, but doesn't travel very far. And mid band is all the stuff in between that kind of propagates kind of far, carries quite a bit of data, but not as much on either side. And on those three dimensions, the US is, I think, far and away the leader in low band spectrum. We've gotten a lot of 700 megahertz and 600 megahertz spectrum now going to market, in addition to all the AWS, the 1.8 gigahertz spectrum. And ultra high band, I'd say the US is also the global leader thus far in terms of getting centimeter wave and millimeter wave spectrum out into the market, talking like 24, 28, 37, 39 gigahertz. The FCC has already held auctions for all of that. It's not in use yet, but it will be soon. We're ahead of the game there. Comparatively, we have more work to do on mid-band. We have major proceedings underway in 2.5 gigahertz, 3.5 gigahertz, the C-band, the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band, also the other half of the C-band, the 6 gigahertz band. Sorry for all the numbers, it's spectrum policy. But anyway, there's a lot going on right now in mid-band. That's what the FCC has been most busy with, I think, so far this year. And we have the upcoming 3.5 auctions, I think, later this year scheduled. Senji, you could maybe correct me on that if I'm wrong. But in terms of spectrum policy, we're doing very well. As I say, ahead of the game in low and high band. In mid band, you could argue we're perhaps a bit behind China and Korea, Japan, but we're quickly closing that gap. And it's not, I mean, it'd be wrong to focus on any one part of the spectrum portfolio because it's all going to be important for different use cases, different topographies, population densities. But in terms of spectrum, there is very much a race underway to get more of it out into the market. And we're doing everything, I think, everything that we can to try and get that out there, at least from the FCC's perspective. On the other, I guess, dimension in terms of infrastructure deployment and red tape and bureaucracy, that's, I guess, an issue that we try to deal with sometimes here in DC, but honestly, a lot of these deployment problems are local issues, state issues, and there is no federal law on a lot of these issues in terms of, access to rights of way, construction permits, zoning laws. There's a lot of different sort of just red tape in the way. If you want to actually go and deploy new fiber or a new cell tower, you have to get approval from lots of different people. And that's one area that we right now are, I mean, at least if you compare us to China, that's one issue where China does not have the same problems, or, you could think of it as a problem in this case, but China has a one state sort of unitary government that does not have state level representation or federalism sort of concepts we have, states' rights. They imposed a blanket rule at the federal level, expediting deployment, saying that you can, if you want to go deploy a cell tower, here's how you do it. You can get it done in 1 or 2 weeks, and that's all. In the US, we have not yet passed a federal infrastructure law like that. There have been bills introduced in Congress in the last 2 Congresses. The Streamline Act, it's a big acronym for something. I don't know exactly, but the Streamline Act, I know in the past Congress, Senators Thune and Schatz introduced it. I believe it was reintroduced in this Congress. I haven't seen the exact text of it yet, but broadly, it would seek to do basically what China has done or other countries looking at this issue have done in terms of imposing a uniform federal framework for a lot of these construction sort of red tape issues in terms of zoning and permitting and rights of way and all the other things you have to do to deploy broadband networks. That's something that right now there is, there's federal laws and policies on some parts of the deployment process, but other parts are left wholly up to the states or even the cities. And similar to what Roz was mentioning earlier with regard to privacy and the problems that business has in navigating a complex legal landscape with multiple different frameworks they have to comply with. If you have that from the perspective of a carrier or a telecom provider, then you also increase your compliance costs, you slow deployment, and you incur a bunch of sort of needless delays and costs. So that's one thing that Congress could do right now to try and speed up the sort of race to 5G and help improve the future outlook for American broadband would be to pass some sort of federal law preempting those various state and local rules and establishing a uniform federal framework for broadband deployment. That's something that I think I would support wholeheartedly if they were to get it right. In the meantime, we have been pushing states to try and adopt their own laws govern at least their own jurisdiction to make it as expeditious as possible. And we encourage many of them to do more in the meantime. And several states have passed small cell bills doing a lot of these same things. But that's one issue that there is still a lot of progress that could be made. And the FCC, for all the good things that it does and all the authority it has, it does not have the authority to address all of these issues. It has done quite a bit. And it is actually in courts litigating some of those recent orders right now in terms of expediting broadband deployment and cutting red tape. There was actually a case, there was a ruling from the DC Circuit, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, but it was on one of the FCC's small cell orders. It was a sort of mixed bag. The court upheld the FCC's expedited shot clocks for review, and they upheld the clarification that consulting fees for siting infrastructure on tribal lands are voluntary, not mandatory. But the efforts the FCC made to exempt small cell deployments from environmental and historical review were struck down. It's questionable whether the FCC can go back and further expedite those or maybe exempt them entirely from those reviews, but they are working hard at the FCC to try and address these things to the extent possible. But at the end of the day, they're a creature of statute and Congress, and there are certain things that only Congress could do. So we encourage them to do what they can and for the FCC to keep doing what they can. But there is still a lot of work to do, particularly on the infrastructure front.
Thank you, Tom. And I just want to be cognizant of the remaining time, so I just want to keep the ball rolling. And Zenji, you already talked about some of the policy solutions that the FCC is working on when it comes to robocalls. But what can you tell us more? What can consumers expect in the year to come? And also, how can consumers, do they have a role to play? How can they be more vigilant when it comes to these issues?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I think my answer will kind of dovetail with a little bit of what Roz has said and Tom. So I want to approach it a little differently. If I were to look at 3 major things, components that sort of like one ring, if you will, that binds them all of these issues that we discussed. One is security. The chairman and I were at the behest of the Department of State and the White House. We were in Prague and helped work on the Prague principles. And so really security comes at the heart, whether you're talking about 5G or you're talking about data privacy. How do we secure our the inputs into the network. And right now, China seems to have a nice a hold on the market, at least with smaller providers, and also in some of the countries in Southeast Asia. So that's one thing. The other thing is technology. As Tom mentioned, we're doing a lot with bringing and trying to roll out spectrum, and we also are very cognizant of protecting how that spectrum is used, like the data that goes over that. The one problem is that you can only regulate something like that so much. We really do need, as Rosie pointed out, technological changes or leveraging technology to address some of those needs. And in point, going back to Shake and Stir as the industry framework for addressing caller ID robocalls, that is a real case in point of leveraging technology and using public sector interest and expertise. I mean, they're the experts and they're in the field to combat this problem. The other thing I wanted to say is about rules and consumers. My parents are saying, "Oh, what do we do? You guys need to have more rules to do this and that." So we do have lots of rules on the books, but as Roz had pointed out, the rules are subject to abuse. For example, under the current TCPA, Telecommunications Consumer Protection Act rules, there's huge litigation going on. Plaintiffs are running amok by taking fragments and bits and pieces of the statute and of our rules and using them to bilk companies, some legitimately and some not, for different technicalities of terms that really, when the rules and laws were drafted, were kind of opaque. So that's one example of just abuse going on. As far as consumers out there, I would say if you get a robocall, our advice is, or if you get a call, look at the number. The beauty is, sure, you can look at the number and that that's maybe my mom or dad calling. But beyond that is start using technology. Again, our iPhones, even our landline phones have the capability of caller ID inputs of creating a whitelist. So create a whitelist on your own. The other thing is encourage, reach out to your provider and say, hey, I heard the FCC has given you guys the green light to go ahead by default to add call blocking tools. I want to make sure I'm signed up for that. And thirdly is that the FCC, of course, and the FTC for fraud issues are always on the standby to receive your complaints 24/7. And if you have any questions, we're more than happy to assist.
Thank you, Zenji. So we're coming close to the end of this webinar, but before we all head out our ways, I'd like to give our panelists last opportunity to make a closing remark and just to maybe highlight what are the key takeaways for consumers. So Roslyn, I'll give it back to you.
So thank you again for this opportunity to participate with ACI and the great panelists. What I would like to emphasize here is I think that in so many of our areas where we have policy opportunities, policy challenges, there's really a multi-stakeholder role where we have to solve a lot of our problems today, we need bottom-up approaches. We need to work with science. We need technology. We need engineers. We need to bring a lot of knowledge together. There's not one actor that necessarily has all the answers, and a good policy will take into account a lot of these different perspectives. And that is also important to get good compliance. You have to have buy-in. And when we look at privacy, I have been encouraged, at least by Congress, has done many hearings. They have tried to get people from across the spectrum. That's been very important to make a policy that gets a lot of those views, gets the things together. Not something that was done in the European Union, but so we have an opportunity in the US to actually make privacy policy that works, that doesn't destroy innovation, that empowers consumers, that promotes prosperity. All those things are important. And I have confidence that Congress will pull it together. It may not be right away, but I think the people in Congress realize what's at stake. We don't want to have companies go out of business because they're trying to do the right thing.
Thank you, Rosalind. Tom?
Sure. So yeah, as I've already said, I think lots of things to get excited about from a consumer perspective, of course, me as a policy perspective. But the one thing I think I have not mentioned, but I think bears mentioning here from the consumer perspective is the competition. So when we talk about the leap forward, the generational shift from 4G to 5G, we are talking about faster speeds and just better cell service, and also new businesses and services that can run on top of that. But actually, just in the telecom world, we are going to see more competition, sort of intermodal competition between wireless providers and the traditional wireline, cable, and telephone companies. That's actually one of the big, I'd say, less hyped conditions that the DOJ and FCC were talking about imposing on T-Mobile Sprint, is to deploy in-home broadband service to tens of millions of American homes. So even if we are going from 4 to 3 carriers in the wireless space, the whole industry is about to get a lot more competitive because 5G and other sort of fixed wireless solutions allow you to get in-home broadband speeds that are at least as good as what your cable and telephone companies, the incumbents, can offer, potentially at lower prices too. So we expect to see more choice and lower prices going forward, in addition to better service and more options. So lots of green shoots. I'm very excited, and I think most consumers in America should be too.
Thank you, Tom. And Zenji?
Yeah, again, just to the consumers, I'd like to reiterate that you do have a way to express your voice, and so I encourage folks, if you do have a robocall complaint, to reach out to the FCC, because we don't know unless you let us know that you have a particular problem. And number two, if it's a fraud issue, of course, you need to reach out to the FTC as well as your local local law enforcement if you've lost money. And the last thing I just wanted to say is that, again, we have to keep in mind this is an economic issue, looking at robocalls, but also looking at spectrum and data privacy issues. They have ties to our economy and ties to, and part of that is the security component of that. How do we make sure that all of these great things are secure and are not abused? Thank you.
So with that, I'd like to thank Rosalind, Tom, and Zenji, and everyone else who has tuned in today. And we look forward to having you all at our next webinar. Thank you.